That night, I was utterly taken aback, but it was one of the most exhilarating nights of my life. The night had descended upon the tranquil suburban neighborhood, and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on my nightstand was the only sound that filled the stillness of my room. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the dim light from the moon filtering through the curtains and casting long shadows across the floor. Sleep eluded me, no matter how exhausted I was. It had been one of those days-long and emotionally draining where everything felt slightly off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I shifted under the covers, pulling them tighter around me, as if that could somehow ease the sense of unease that had been following me all day. My phone buzzed softly beside me, a message from my stepbrother, Dylan. "You okay?" the text read. I stared at the screen, contemplating whether to answer. Dylan had been acting strangely lately, more withdrawn and distant than usual. We had always been close growing up, spending long summers together, laughing and sharing secrets. But ever since our parents had married, something had shifted between us. I couldn't quite tell if it was the change in family dynamics or if it was something deeper, more personal. Before I could reply, I heard a soft creak from the hallway, the sound of footsteps, muffled and hesitant, slowly approaching my door. My heart began to race, though I couldn't say why. It was probably just someone getting a drink or heading to the bathroom. But the footsteps stopped right outside my door, lingering for a moment, as if waiting for permission to enter. I lay still, fighting sleep, but I could feel the tension building in the air. The door didn't open, and after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded back down the hall. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I turned over, glancing at the time. It was nearly 1 a.m. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but I shook it off. This was ridiculous, I told myself. There was nothing out of the ordinary. I was just being paranoid. But sleep still wouldn't come. Instead, I lay there, eyes wide open, listening to every creak and groan of the old house. Finally, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted into a restless. But my slumber didn't last long. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I became aware of something, or rather, someone in the. I couldn't explain it, but there was a presence, close, looming. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, my limbs refusing to respond. It was as though I was trapped in a strange, dreamlike state where I was both awake and asleep at the same time. I felt the sheets shift, the subtle tug of weight being added to the bed beside me. My breath hitched in my throat, but I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then I felt Ida touch, light, tentative, grazing my arm. My skin prickled with fear, and 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Who was here? What were they doing? But it didn't stop. The touch grew bolder, moving slowly, tracing down my arm, then gently across my back. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand that they stop, but the paralysis that held me in its grip wouldn't release. And then I heard a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Shh. It was Dylan's voice. I struggled to process what was happening. Dylan, my stepbrother. My mind raced as I lay there, frozen, still unable to move. The warmth of his breath brushed against my neck, and I felt his hand hesitate for just a second, as if he were questioning his own act. The moment stretched endlessly, but he didn't stop. His fingers trailed down my spine, the thin fabric of my pajama top doing little to shield me from the sensation. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't speak, couldn't open my eyes to confront him. It was as if my body had betrayed me, locking me in this nightmare with no way. I couldn't understand why he was doing this. We'd grown up together. This was Dylan, my stepbrother, the same person who used to tease me relentlessly, who would laugh at my clumsy attempts to keep up with him when we were kids. There had never been anything inappropriate between us, not even close. So why? As his hand lingered on my waist, I felt a conflicting storm of emotions swirling inside me: confusion, fear, even a disturbing mix of anger and shame. My heart was racing, and I wanted to bolt out of the room to make sense of this sick game he was playing. But my body refused to cooperate. He leaned closer, and I could hear his breathing quicken, matching the pounding of my own heartbeat. The weight of his presence was overwhelming, and I wondered if this was some kind of twisted dream. Maybe I was imagining this. Maybe my mind, exhausted and stressed, was playing tricks on me. But everything felt too real, too immediate. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Dylan withdrew his touch, vanishing as if he had never been there. I heard the faint rustling of sheets, and the mattress shifted as he got. The soft sound of his footsteps drifted back toward the door. My body remained paralyzed, and I waited, breath shallow and ragged, as he left the room, closing the door quietly behind. For a long time I stayed frozen, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. The silence of the house pressed down on me, but my thoughts were too loud, too chaotic to find any peace. I wanted to confront him, demand an explanation. But how could I? What if I had imagined the whole thing? What if I was wrong? But deep down, I knew I was. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into a fitful sleep, though the memory of Dylan's touch haunted me throughout the night. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my alarm buzzing angrily from the nightstand. The events of the night flooded back to me, and a cold knot of anxiety twisted in my stomach. I sat up, the room bathed in the soft, early light of dawn. It felt like any other day, but everything was different now. Dylan's door was closed when I stepped out into the hall. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, wondering if he was awake, if he remembered what had happened, or if he regretted it. I made my way downstairs, trying to push the thoughts aside. But when I entered the kitchen, there he was, sitting at the table, casually scrolling through his phone, as if nothing had happened. His hair was slightly tousled, and he glanced up at me with the same calm, easy smile he always had. "Morning," he said, his voice light, normal. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing, but I forced myself to respond. "Morning." I couldn't bring myself to look directly at him as I busied myself making coffee, my hands trembling as I tried to keep them steady. The silence between us felt oppressive, but Dylan acted like nothing had changed, like we were still the same step-siblings we had always been. But I knew better. I sat down at the far end of the table, my eyes fixed on the mug in front of me, but I could feel his gaze on me, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I even begin to explain what I thought had happened? How could I accuse him if I wasn't absolutely sure? And yet, deep inside, I was sure. I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my skin, the memory of his breath against my neck. But saying it out loud would change everything, and I wasn't ready for that. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension anymore, he stood up, stretching lazily. "I'm heading out for a bit," he said, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. I nodded, barely able to manage a response. He lingered in the doorway for a second longer than necessary, then left without another word. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, I exhaled sharply, realizing I had been holding my breath. My mind was spinning. What was I supposed to do now? Confront him? Pretend it never happened? But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore it, and there was more. The day dragged on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. I couldn't stop replaying the events of the night before in my mind, over and over, trying to find an explanation, a reason, anything that could make it make sense. But every time I came back to the same conclusion. Dylan had crossed a line, and I had to do something about it. But the question was, by the time the evening rolled around, the house was still quiet. I had spent the entire day on edge, flinching at every sound, half expecting Dylan to walk through the door and force a confrontation. But he didn't come back. As the hours ticked by, I felt a creeping sense of dread settle in. What was I supposed to say when I saw him again? How was I supposed to act? Could I pretend that everything was normal like he had? Or would I confront him, demand answers, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear? The tension was unbearable. Finally, as the sun began to set, I heard the familiar sound of the front door creaking open. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze where I stood, halfway to the kitchen. His footsteps were soft, deliberate, as if he was trying to be as quiet as possible. I turned slowly, just in time to see Dylan standing in the doorway, his eyes locked on mine. For a second, neither of us said anything. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. My mouth went dry, and I felt the air between us grow charged, heavy with unspoken words. "Hey," he said, his voice almost too casual, like nothing had changed. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to look away. "Hey." He dropped his bag on the floor and leaned against the doorframe, watching me with that same unreadable expression I had come to. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to say something. "I need to talk to you," I blurted out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound calm. His eyes flickered with something surprise, guilt, but he quickly masked it with a lazy smile. "Okay, what's up?" I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I struggled to find the right word. How could I confront him about what happened without everything spiraling out of control? But there was no easy way to say it, no simple way to bring up what he had done last. I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "You came into my room, didn't you?" His expression shifted ever so slightly, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes dark, unreadable. "What are you talking about?" he finally asked, his tone steady, controlled. My stomach churned. Was he going to deny? Was he going to pretend like nothing had happened? I had to keep going, had to push through the fear and confusion that threatened to paralyze me. "I wasn't imagining," I said, my voice firmer this time. "You were there. I know it was you." Dylan's jaw clenched, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his calm facade. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were trying to gauge how serious I was. "And if I was," he said, his voice lower now, almost challenging, "what are you going to do about it?" The room seemed to tilt around me, my breath catching in my throat. His words hung in the air, sharp and dangerous, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. "I just want to know why," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Why would you do something like that?" For a moment, Dylan looked away, as if he couldn't bear to meet my eye. The silence stretched on, each second more unbearable than the last, until finally he spoke. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight, almost strangled. "I don't know why I did it." His confession hung in the air between us, heavy and I felt a strange mix of relief and anger bubbling up inside Mirrorleaf, that he wasn't going to deny it, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But the anger simmered beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing. "That's not good enough," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "You can't just say you don't know." But before I could finish, he cut me off, his voice rising, sharp and defensive. "You think I wanted to do?" he snapped, his face twisting with something I couldn't quite name. Guilt, shame, maybe both. "You think I don't hate myself for it? It just happened." Okay. I wasn't thinking. His words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had wanted answers, but now that I had them, they only made things worse. This wasn't a mistake he could brush off. This wasn't something he could just explain away. But there was more. "I've been dealing with a lot lately," Dylan continued, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Everything's been messed up since our parents got married. I don't know how to deal with it." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. I wanted to understand, to make sense of the mess we were in, but nothing he said could justify what he had. Nothing could erase the memory of his touch, the way he had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. "I don't care what's going on with you," I said, my voice cold, my hands trembling. "You had no right to do that to me." He winced, as if my words had physically hurt him, but I didn't back down. I couldn't. This wasn't just about him. It was about what he had done to me, and I wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. "I know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But sorry wasn't enough. The silence that followed Dylan's apology was unbearable. The weight of his words hung in the air, but they didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. It wasn't enough, not after what he had done. He stood there, eyes downcast, his whole demeanor collapsing under the guilt that now coated every inch of the room. I wanted to say something, anything that would make this all make sense, that would fix what was broken between us. But how could I? There were no words strong enough to patch up the gaping hole that had torn through our relationship. "I don't know what you want me to do," Dylan finally whispered, his voice so low I barely heard him. "I can't take it back. I can't undo it." And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I saw the truth in his eyes, the regret, the shame, the fear of losing everything he'd taken for granted. But even that didn't make what he'd done okay. Even that couldn't erase the violation I had felt in the dark of the night when I thought I was safe. "I need space," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I need time to figure this out." Dylan's shoulders sagged, and he ran a hand through his hair, his expression one of defeat. He didn't argue, didn't beg me for forgiveness. He just nodded, eyes still avoiding mine, and turned to leave. As he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, glancing back at me with a look that was equal parts apology and desperation. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice barely audible. "I hope you can believe that." But I couldn't, not yet. Maybe not ever. I didn't respond as he walked out of the room, the sound of the door softly closing behind him echoing in the hollow silence that followed. The tension in the air lifted slightly with his departure, but it didn't disappear completely. I could still feel it clinging to the walls, lingering in the spaces between the memories we had shared before everything went wrong. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my mind racing. How was I supposed to move forward from this? How could I ever look at him the same way again? The person I had grown up with, trusted, even loved in a way only step-siblings could, had shattered all of that in one night, and I couldn't piece it back together, no matter how much I wanted to. Hours passed in a blur. I sat there, staring at nothing, letting the weight of what had happened press down on me. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. The night had changed everything, and I wasn't sure if we could ever come back from it. But life didn't stop just because my world had been turned upside down. The sun had long since set, and the house had fallen into an uneasy quiet. It was only then that I realized how long I had been sitting there, lost in thought. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since morning, but the idea of food made me nauseous. I couldn't stay here, not tonight. I needed to get out, to breathe, to think without the walls of this house closing in on me. Grabbing my phone and keys, I left the house, not bothering to tell anyone where I was going. I didn't know myself. I just needed to be anywhere but here. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head, but the memory of Dylan's touch, his voice, the tension between us refused to leave. It was as if it had embedded itself into my skin, a constant reminder of everything that had happened. I walked without direction, my feet carrying me through the quiet streets of the neighborhood. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows on the pavement, and the sound of distant traffic was the only noise that broke the stillness. I needed to think, to make sense of the mess I was in, but no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, nothing could justify what had happened. Eventually, I found myself at the small park near the edge of the neighborhood. It was deserted, as expected at this. I made my way to the swings, the same ones Dylan and I used to play on when we were younger. The irony wasn't lost on me. We had shared so many good memories here, laughing and teasing each other like siblings. And now here I was, trying to process the fact that the person I had trusted the most had betrayed me in the worst way possible. I sat down on one of the swings, the chains creaking softly as I moved back and forth. The familiar motion was soothing in a way, but it did little to ease the storm brewing inside. My mind kept circling back to the same question. What now? Could I confront my parents? Could I tell them what had happened? The thought filled me with dread. How would they react? Would they believe me, or would they side with Dylan, the golden boy who could do no wrong in their eyes? The weight of the decision pressed down on me. I didn't want to destroy the family, to tear apart the fragile peace we had built over the years, but I couldn't keep this secret. It was too heavy, too painful. Every time I thought about it, my chest tightened with a mix of anger, fear, and sadness. I didn't know how long I sat there, lost in. The gentle creaking of the swing was the only sound in the quiet night. Time seemed to blur, the minutes bleeding into each other, until I finally felt the cold seeping into my bones. I stood up, rubbing my arms to ward off the chill, and began the slow walk back home. The house was dark when I returned. I let myself in quietly, hoping to avoid any more confrontations tonight. As I climbed the stairs, I hesitated outside Dylan's door. It was closed, the soft sound of his breathing barely audible from the hallway. For a moment, I considered knocking, considered trying to have one more conversation. But I couldn't, not yet. The wounds were too fresh, too raw. I needed time, we both did. I slipped back into my room, closing the door softly behind me. The darkness enveloped me, but this time it wasn't comforting. It felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in, pressing down on me, with the weight of everything that had happened. I crawled into bed, pulling the blankets tightly around me, as if that could somehow shield me from the reality I was living in. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same. The days ahead loomed before me, filled with uncertainty, fear, and the overwhelming question of what to do next. And as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I knew this was only the beginning. And it definitely was, as the story didn't end there. The following days were a blur. Time passed, but I was barely present. I went through the motions, waking up, pretending everything was fine, avoiding Dylan as much as possible. Our parents didn't seem to notice the change in the air between us, but I felt it in every interaction, in every awkward silence at the dinner table, and in every fleeting glance that held far too much unspoken. Dylan avoided me too. We shared the same roof, but it felt like we were living in completely different worlds. I could see the guilt weighing heavily on him, pressing down on his every move. He wasn't the same carefree, confident Dylan I had grown up with. He seemed smaller, quieter, always watching me from the corner of his eye, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. I couldn't pretend forever, and the more I tried to keep it all bottled up inside, the heavier it became. I spent hours lying awake at night, replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of it all. But I couldn't. Every time I thought I had found a way to cope, a way to move forward, I would remember the feeling of his touch, the whisper of his voice, and it would all come crashing back. I knew I couldn't keep this secret forever. The decision to tell someone weighed heavily on me. What would happen if I did? Would it destroy Would our family fall apart? Or would it be the only way to start healing, to finally confront what had happened instead of burying it deeper each? One night, after another sleepless bout of tossing and turning, I knew what I had to. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be pretty. But I couldn't live like this anymore, carrying the weight of what Dylan had done, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I had to talk to my parents. They deserved to know the truth. The next morning, I waited until Dylan had left for work. I needed to do this without him there, without the pressure of his presence looming over the conversation. I found my mom in the kitchen, sipping her coffee and flipping through a magazine, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. I stood in the doorway for a long time, my heart racing, my hands trembling. How could I possibly explain what had happened without tearing our family apart? How could I say the words out loud? But I had to. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, smiling at me. "Hey, sweetie, you're up early." I nodded, my stomach churned. "Can we talk?" "It's important." Her smile faltered, concern flickering across her face as she set her coffee mug down. "Of course. What's going on?" I didn't know how to begin. I didn't have a script, no rehearsed lines, just the truth, raw and painful. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "It's about Dylan." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the concern growing. "What about—" I swallowed hard, forcing the words out before I lost my nerve. "Something happened. Something that shouldn't have." Her face paled, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice suddenly more serious. "What do you mean? What happened?" Tears stung my eyes, but I fought them back, refusing to let them fall. I had to be strong. I had to get through this. That night, a few weeks ago, he came into my room while I was sleeping. She didn't speak for a moment, her expression frozen in shock. I could see her trying to process what I was saying, the pieces slowly clicking together. And she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked down at my hands, my throat tightening. "He touched me, Mom. It wasn't right. It wasn't okay." The silence that followed was unbearable. My mom just sat there, staring at me as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I couldn't tell if she was angry, hurt, or just shocked, maybe all three. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I blinked, feeling the tears finally break free. "I didn't know how. I didn't want to ruin everything. I didn't want to tear our family apart." My mom stood up, crossing the room and pulling me into a tight hug. I could feel her body trembling, her breath shaking against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." We stood there for what felt like hours, both of us trying to come to terms with the reality of what had happened. I had dreaded this moment, feared that it would break us. But instead, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, as if a weight had finally been lifted from my chest. But it wasn't over. There was still Dylan and my dad. The truth had to come out. When my father returned from work later that evening, my mom sat him down and explained everything. The look on his face, the shock, the disbelief, the anger was almost too much to bear. He couldn't comprehend it, couldn't believe that his son, Dylan, would do something like that. But the truth was undeniable. Confronting Dylan was the hardest part. My father demanded answers, but Dylan barely spoke. He stood there, his head hanging low, as my parents laid into him, their voices trembling with anger and disappointment. He didn't defend himself. He didn't offer excuses. He just kept saying he was sorry, over and over again. But sorry wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase what he had done. It wasn't enough to fix the broken trust between us. And it wasn't enough to heal the pain that now lingered in every corner of our home. That night, Dylan packed his things and left. He moved out of the house, giving us the space we all desperately needed. I didn't know where he went, and I didn't ask. All I knew was that things would never be the same. But in the weeks that followed, there was a strange sense of peace that settled over the house. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but there was. Slowly, my parents and I began to pick up the pieces, to talk openly about what had happened, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. It took time, it took tears, it took uncomfortable conversations, and moments where everything still felt wrong. But we made it through. We survived. As for Dylan, I didn't speak to him for a long time. I needed the distance, the space, to figure out who I was without the shadow of that night looming over. It wasn't until months later that I got a letter from him. A letter filled with apologies, regret, and promises to never cross that line again. I read it, but I didn't respond. Because healing, true healing, takes time. I told myself to respond later. But I have never responded.